Wouldn't have created Florida.
Can I quote you?
Sure. It's part of the theme of today's learning: creation, revelation, redemption. Why there's a Florida. I've got to watch my clock because the time is now 12 p.m. on the nose, and so that is when I believe that our class has officially begun. And so in just a few moments, we will start the learning. I'm going to wait a moment or two to let others who are going to join us come and join us. Here comes one more right now. And so what I'm going to do now is talk about what we're going to talk about before we talk about it. Really as a way just to vamp for a minute or two until a few more people arrive. But what we're going to look at over the next 3 weeks, in particular, is a particular part of the worship service, the blessings around the Shema. And we're going to talk a little bit about how they came to be thematically and in that order, and how that construct reinforces a very important theological premise in the tradition. And with that in mind, I think that we are going to be ready to begin. I'm going to keep everyone on mute for now. Feel free to use the chat as you come in. If you want to put a question into the chat, I'm going to have my eyes on that as well. Or you can just like do one of these and raise your hand, and I'll be sure to answer the question as well. So with that, good afternoon, everyone. Welcome to Lunch and Learn as we begin a conversation today about creation, revelation, and redemption, understanding the message of the worship service. Now, of course, I have to add a coda already, or a modifier. It's not really the message of the worship service as much as a message of the worship service. Right? Because if we know that our worship service has multiple parts to it. There's warm-up pieces at the beginning, there's the Shema and its blessings, there's the Amidah, there's the Torah service, there's concluding pieces, and so all of those have in some ways their own messaging and then are part of a larger rubric. So we're going to be looking today particularly at that section in the middle, as a call in Hebrew, Shema uvirchoteha, the Shema and her blessings. As part of the learning today, we are going to be engaging with holy texts, with words from Mishnah and Talmud. And so, as we often do when we begin study of Torah itself, we will say together the words of the blessing. Baruch atah Adonai, Eloheinu melech haolam, asher kitshanu b'mitzvotav v'tzivanu la'asok b'divrei Torah. Blessed are you, Adonai, our God, ruler of the universe, who makes us holy with your commandments and commands us to engage in the study of Torah. Okay, now that we are into it, let's get into it. We're going to look today at these 3 elements, the 3 plot points around the big cosmologic and theologic premise that is Judaism. And those 3 premises are creation, revelation, and redemption. Raise your hand if you can tell me what creation is. Dan, go ahead, unmute yourself.
The beginning of all things.
Yeah, and who did that in the Jewish mind?
God.
Yeah, creation was God bringing the universe into being with the word, right? God spoke, the world became. Right? We can talk about the 7 days as discussed in the first chapter of Genesis, or the sort of one-time experience in the second chapter of the book of Genesis, but this idea that God desired to create, God spoke, and the universe came into being. And that obviously was an important point in the story of how we are here. Because if it wasn't for creation, none of us would be here. It is our origin story. And so it's one piece in the story. The second piece in the story is the piece of revelation, right? Not the book of Revelation that we would read from the New Testament. That's something related but different. When I say the word revelation, And I say it in the context of Jewish thought, Jewish theology, Jewish cosmology. What is revelation in the Jewish mindset? Steve.
What was given on Sinai.
Yeah. And I want to certainly, yes, Sinai is a big piece of it, although I would offer a little modifier, right? So what happened at Mount Sinai? God spoke to us, right? God spoke to us through the conduit of prophets, most often Moses. But this idea of revelation is revealing, right? God revealing, sharing of the wisdom that God holds with us. Primarily at Sinai, but also later, right? Because if we think about it, right, all of the books of the prophets and the wisdom and less so much the instruction, because we think about the mitzvot all being limited to Torah, but the wisdom that comes to us through the prophets, through Isaiah, through Jeremiah, through Amos, through Ovadia, whoever it might be, which are really important pieces of our tradition and do a lot to frame and contextualize the earlier revelation from Sinai, right? That came later, right? God did not speak to Ovadia at Mount Sinai. God spoke to Ovadia where Ovadia was. God spoke to Amos where Amos was. We know God spoke to Jonah and Nineveh, right? All those different places. And I categorize that into this idea of revelation, right? So the greatest revelation, both in terms of, I think, scale and also importance, was what was revealed at Mount Sinai. But the idea of revelation, continues as long as there are prophets, right? We know that at a certain point, the tradition says this is now the end of the period of prophecy. There are no more prophets, so there is no more revelation. But it did continue after Sinai. Just as a reminder for those of you who are less schooled in the conversation around what is Torah, right? We can talk about Torah as being the 5 books of Moses, but I would say that's a less helpful descriptor for the conversation that we're going to have. When I say Torah and Mount Sinai, what I really mean is the writ large one, the written Torah, the oral Torah. I'm going to include Tanakh in all that, right? So yes, the other books of prophecy. Yes, the books of the writings like Psalms and Proverbs and all that kind of stuff. Yes, Mishnah. Yes, Talmud. Yes, Midrashim. All of that. And then even the real man-made stuff later, the books, the halachic books and all that, and even books that are being written today, Jewish thinking, Jewish philosophy. In my mind, I have this very maximalist view of Torah. And all of that is revelation to a certain degree. Some of it is from words of God, and some of it is humans talking about that, but that's this idea. That all of it is us trying to understand what God wants from us. Some of it comes right from, and this is an awful metaphor to use when we're talking about revelation, but right from the horse's mouth, right? And some of it is us thinking about it and writing about it later, but all of it is in the same notion of how can we understand what God wants from us? And the third piece of this big theological rubric is redemption. What's redemption? Robin, and then Sue. Robin, you're still on mute. We can't hear what you're saying yet.
God freeing the Israelites from slavery in Egypt.
So one example of redemption is just that, right? God delivering us from Egypt, right? Bringing us out, right? That's the same and we use that idea of redemption also talking about like redeeming captives, right? Or redeeming the firstborn, the pidyon haben, taking them from one state on this earth to somewhere else, freeing them from some kind of chained bondage in one way or another, right? Without saying that all bondage is equal, because it's not, right? The bondage of a firstborn son to temple service is not the same as the bondage of a captive. It's not the same as the bondage of the Jews, of the Israelites in Egypt. But this notion is that bringing them all out of that state. Sue, what were you going to offer?
I have nothing new to offer, nothing to add.
Okay. So I'm going to suggest that in the historical worldview of the Torah, The redemption of the Israelites from Egypt was a momentous occasion, but the idea of redemption was just getting started. Susan, what do you want to offer?
Can we say that redemption is also a personal redemption as opposed to a collective one?
Say more about what you mean by that, please.
That each person has to be redeemed by their actions and their, as opposed to just, yes, the big thing is the delivery from Egypt, but each person has to be redeemed as well.
So I'm gonna pick up this ball you're running with and run with it, and maybe give it back to you in a moment, because what I think that you're doing is helpful, but you're conflating two different types of redemption, which is exactly where we want to end up, right? None of us in this conversation today, none of us were physically present in Egypt, right? We can talk about the idea that our souls were there at Egypt, or that our souls were there at Sinai, but none of us were alive when the Israelites went forth from Egypt. So we did not ourselves participate in the redemption from Egypt. But Susan, in this idea of a personal redemption, Susan's alluding to this notion that there is a redemption that I am eligible for, right? There is some kind of redemption that I could think about maybe striving towards. That has to be separate from Egypt. Why? Because Egypt already happened several thousand years ago, right? And if the only redemption that we were talking about was a redemption from Egypt, been there, done that. Problem solved. But what do we know about the world that arises out of the redemption from Egypt? We know that there's some other type of redemption that we're thinking about. So taking Susan's notion that there is a personal element to that redemption, I'm going to turn the question back to the group. And Susan, if you want to answer, you can. And if you don't, that's okay. If someone else wants to join in, that's great too. What is this other redemption we're talking about that has at least two iterations? The personal that Susan was alluding to, and something else we haven't even named yet. What is that redemption? Ooh, I've stumped you.
I'm afraid I don't quite understand the question.
Okay, that's a fair observation. That's fine. Other than, or in addition to the redemption from Egypt, is there another redemption that is in the Jewish worldview that we're thinking about? Right? And my answer is yes, there is. There is another redemption. There is something else that we're thinking about. It's not just the redemption from Egypt, because if it was just the redemption from Egypt, that would not be a theological premise for us, because it already happened. We need something else. Barbara, unmute yourself first so we can hear your brilliant comment.
Okay.
Go
Can you
ahead.
hear me?
Now we can, yes.
Okay. Could it be personal redemption that we're constantly doing like we do on Yom Kippur? We redeem ourselves and to try to better ourselves?
That's a piece of it. Yeah, that's a piece of it. What I'm going to suggest is that in addition to the national redemption that took place in Egypt, there is also a national and really an all of humanity redemption that we are looking forward towards. And that has both personal pieces to it and universal pieces to it, right? This idea that there is another redemption, a bigger redemption coming when? Well, as we allude to at one point in our liturgy, Bayom Hahu, on that day, right? When we say Aleinu, Bayom Hahu Yehiyeh Adonai Echad U'Shmo Echad, on that day, God will be one and God's name will be one. That's the redemption that we're also talking about, that there is a future time, right? This is the Messianic age. This is Olam Haba. This is the things that we are theologically oriented towards pursuing as individuals and as a nation. Right? That thing that we're working towards is also described as redemption. We are redeemed out of the world that we know as it is now, a world in which we are separate from the Holy One, a world in which there is things like pestilence, war, and famine, sometimes all in one day, to a world in which we live together in peace and in harmony. Right? When we say, Oseh Shalom Bimromav, Hu Ya'aseh Shalom Aleinu, Ve'al Kol Yisrael, and if for progresses, Ve'al Kol Yoshvei Tevel. Oseh Shalom Bimromav, the one who makes peace from up on high. Hu Ya'aseh Shalom Aleinu, God, may you bring peace upon us. Ve'al Kol Yisrael, and all of Israel. Ve'al Kol Yoshvei Tevel, and all who dwell on this earth. Ve'imru Amen, and let us say Amen, so may it be. That future, messianic, peaceful, all is well, all is good, yay us world, that's the redemption that we are striving for. And as both Susan and Barbara suggested, there is a personal element to that. Meaning there's both this notion that we are all going to get there together, and I have a role to play in my life to make that happen. My role in that is by being a good person, by improving myself, right? By making myself eligible for my role in that redemption. And if we all do that, well, then we'll make it happen, right? Of course, the challenge is what happens if half of us do it and half of us don't, right? Well, then we're stuck where we are, right? And until we all get there, that's where we are. I'm going to take us back now in history just over 100 years. Actually, 100 years, and then we're going to go back a little bit before that. In 1921, Franz Rosenzweig published a very powerful philosophical theological work called The Star of Redemption. Franz Rosenzweig was a German Jew, barely meaning he was totally German, he was barely Jewish. He was of that branch of Judaism that was, and listen, I'll be honest, like when we think about progressive Judaism, think about Reform Judaism, we know that the slippery slope that progressive Judaism can sometimes fall victim to is that I'm not participatory, right? I don't do anything, so I call myself Reform, right? I am assimilated, I am secular, I am not engaged, and conflating that with reform, right? There have always been Jews that are unengaged, unencumbered, fairly assimilated, and that was certainly Franz Rosenzweig in the first couple decades of the 20th century. He had a couple of moments. There's this very powerful story told that he was that close to converting to Christianity, and then he had kind of an epiphany on Yom Kippur and decided that Judaism was too powerful for him. But the book Star of Redemption, which was published in 1921, was actually written, he wrote it on note cards during World War I. These ideas that he was having while he was fighting in the war, he was writing these things down on like army issue, like field note cards, is how he put the ideas on before he finally published it as a collection. And what he does is he puts together this star. Not surprising, the star takes on what form? The Mogen David, right? The Jewish star, the six-pointed star. And he weaves together 6 disparate notions in 2 different groups. One group is God, humanity, and the universe as the loci of this story. Locuses, loci, loci. And the other are these 3 theological moments and principles: creation, revelation, redemption. And he offers this as the way that Jews see both space and time and the course of the universe. This is the meta story. This is Jewish metaphysics from before to now to after. It goes like this. God creates. What did God create? The universe and human beings. Okay. God reveals. God offers revelation to humanity as they are situated in the universe. So now we've got God, universe, human beings, creation, and revelation. Those 5 pieces to the puzzle already exist. Who then is responsible for redemption? If you think you have an answer, go ahead and unmute yourself and chime in.
Each individual and then the entire kahal, the entire world.
Yeah. Human being, and human beings, right? Not God. Us. We are responsible. And how do we get there? How do we know what we're supposed to do to bring about redemption? Revelation. We learn what was in the revelation. We learn the Torah. Because for us, Torah is the revelation. It's the blueprint. It's the manual. It's the instruction that brings us towards redemption. And this is the other piece of it. When human beings bring the words of the revelation to life, when they bring about redemption, that also has a spatial impact on these relationships. When we bring redemption, it brings God down into the universe in unity with human beings. Right? When we look at the star as it is now, God is up on top and human beings in the universe are on the bottom. But the idea of revelation flattens that. We bring about a world wherein we dwell with God. We bring about a universe wherein we dwell with God, as the result of the revelation being brought to fruition and the redemption that happens. This is heavy stuff for a Tuesday at 12:20. You didn't sign up for this necessarily. I always believe that philosophy is best studied with a glass of whiskey. I didn't offer you one of those this morning, but I think it's helpful. When I took my philosophy classes, there was a glass of whiskey at the ready when I needed it, just to help loosen the joints a little bit. Now, I will suggest that this idea that God created the universe, God has given us a set of instructions, and we have a certain set of responsibilities, and when those responsibilities are fulfilled, the world order will be changed. That's a fairly common worldview that is shared by more than just Jews. Right? Some of the details might be different. But this idea that we're building towards something else, we see that in Christianity. Right? As Philip commented several minutes ago in the chat, Christian theology is based on redemption through Jesus, right? The life and death and purported resurrection of Jesus of Nazareth, that changed what the course or the journey towards redemption looked like. And this notion of personal redemption versus, like, it's there though. It's still this idea that there's something in the future that we're building towards. And Rosenzweig did a very good job of explaining how Judaism understands this piece. God created us. God revealed to us God's wisdom through Torah. Our job is to put the words of Torah to life. And when we do that well enough, that will bring about redemption, and we will be reunified with God. Any questions? Any wonderings? Any objections? Seeing none, we're going to move forward. Total change in perspective now. We're going to shift gears significantly. Where do our prayers come from? Margaret. Margaret, unmute yourself first so we can hear you.
Well, I think most people would say their heart, or the depth of their soul. They could be troubled. You could be, I think from your soul.
That's a great answer to a question that I asked that I didn't mean to ask that way. I phrased my question very, very poorly. Because when I said, where do our prayers come from, what I meant was, where does Jewish liturgy come from? Where do the prayers of the Jewish people that are written in the prayer book, where do they come from? Right? Because Margaret, you're right. Like when we pray, it comes from our souls. It comes from our deep within. I asked my question poorly, right? We're here to talk about the Jewish worship service. So my question I'm going to reframe is, the prayers that are in our worship service, where do they come from?
From Torah quite often.
So not really. Not Torah. Right? Prayer doesn't really exist much in Torah. And I'm glad you raised that. I'm going to use it as a straw man for a second, Margaret, right? Because in Torah, the way that we worship God is not through prayer, but through sacrifice, predominantly, right? We bring the animal sacrifices to the temple or to the tabernacle at certain times and certain occasions. We know, for example, from the story of Hannah and Samuel, right, that when she prayed, right, from the depths of her soul and moving her lips, people thought she was nuts. Because the idea of just speaking to God and God hearing was like beyond what they did back then. Right? So I'm going to suggest that the source of our prayers that you and I know well isn't actually Torah. It's a little bit later. Robin, you want to take a stab at it? Robin, you're still on mute.
I know. I was trying to unmute. The rabbis.
Can you be more specific? You're right. Can you be more specific?
Well, long ago, after the temple was destroyed.
Yeah. And I would say at the very beginning of that period, right? In fact, the very beginning, right? So that's we call that the Mishnah, right? The Mishnaic period, right? The temple's destroyed. Around the year 200, we have this collection that's called the Mishnah. And the Mishnah begins with these words: Me'ematai kor'ina Shema ba'aravit. At what time does one recite the Shema in the evening? Right? And we talked about this before for those of you who've learned with me, and this notion that what's implied in the opening statement of the Shema, at what time does one say the Shema in the evening? So the opening phrase of the Mishnah is, we must have a custom or a practice of reciting the Shema at certain times of the day, at least in the evening. And as we know, the morning as well. So by then there already is this notion that there are certain times of the day when Jews gather to recite certain things. One of those things is the Shema, Deuteronomy chapter 6, verse 4, and also verses 5 and following, and selections from Numbers and elsewhere in the Torah. That's the beginning of the Mishnah. And just this is where it gets confusing, because the proper descriptor of a verse in the Mishnah is a Mishnah. The Mishnah is divided into 6 Sedarim, 6 orders, mega chapters. The individual chapters are called, in English, tractates. In Hebrew, a masechet, or masechtot, is the plural. So the very first masechet in the Mishnah is called brachot, blessings. Each masechet is broken up into parakim, into chapters. And the parakim are broken up into mishnayot, individual mishnahs. So this is the 4th Mishnah of the first chapter of Masechet Brachot of the Mishnah. Mishnah Brachot 1:4. A little nomenclature for everybody. And it reads like this. In the morning, one recites 2 blessings before it and 1 after it. In the evening, 2 before it and 2 after it. one long and one short. Where they, the sages, said that a long one should be said, one may not say a short one. Where they said a short one, one may not say a long one. Where they said to conclude with a blessing, one is not permitted to not conclude. Where they said not to conclude with a blessing, one may not conclude. This is that rabbinic circular logic that just jumps off the page in clarity, right? Very clear what we're talking about here. Don't worry, I'll break this apart. This is where every rabbinic student breaks their teeth on Mishnaic Hebrew. What is this telling us? Well, let me ask this question. In the first clause, in the morning one recites 2 blessings before it and 1 after it. Who wants to guess at what the it is?
The Shema.
The Shema. Thank you, Sue. Right? The it is the Shema. So in the morning we say 2 blessings before it and 1 after it. In the evening, 2 before it and 2 after it. Good. Hold on to that. The rest of it has to, long and short, has to do with whether or not the blessings begin with the phrase that we sometimes abbreviate Boi Ima, right? Which means mom, come here. But Boi Ima means Baruch Atah Adonai Eloheinu Melech HaOlam. If you take those 6 words and make an acronym, it says Boi Ima. And in the language of the Mishnah, a long blessing is a blessing that begins with those words and ends with at least half of it, Boi. Baruch Atah Adonai, something else. That's a long blessing. A short blessing is one that just opens up in the middle. Doesn't open with the opening phrase, Baruch Atah Adonai. Right? So if you think about the Amidah, for example, you got an opening, a bunch of blessings, each ending with the thing at the end, which we call a Chatima, and then we conclude it at the end. Same is true with the Shema and its blessings, right? If we think about what that looks like, what do the Shema and its blessings look like? Well, there's a morning version, there's an evening version. In the morning, we have Yotzeir Or. In the evening, Ma'ariv Aravim. In the morning, Ahava Rabbah. In the evening, Ahavat Olam. In the morning and the evening, 2 before. What comes next?
2 after.
Anvei Hafta. That's the core. In the morning, 1 blessing after, Emet V'Yetziv. In the evening, another one, Emet V'Emunah. Built into each of those, and in our movement, we typically jump to this, Micha Mocha. And then in the evening, there's an extra blessing, the 2 before, 2 after, Hashkivenu. So I'm going to invite us to deal with the last part first, which is Hashkivenu. What's the message of Hashkivenu?
To listen.
No. Let us lay down and rise up in peace and safety. Guard us, Dera, Cherev, V'Ra'a, right? Guard us from beast and sword and all. Hashkivenu is about security and safety. Hashkivenu is an extra blessing we say at the evening,
Right.
because in the ancient world, evening times were dangerous times, right? There was fear of animal, marauding horde, storm, right? It's dark. You didn't know what was going to happen. And so we have this extra blessing in the evening that is really about, God, may I go to bed tonight safely? May I lay down, Hashkivenu, lay down, and may I get up again in the morning? Because, you know what? Not everyone wakes up in the morning, God forbid. Putting Hashkivenu aside for a moment because it doesn't fit the larger rubric, because it's this intentional, temporal, timely evening blessing about the evening. If we look at these other 6 blessings, what's the theme of Yotzeir? And I will give you a hint. The theme is also the theme of Ma'ariv Aravim. Dan? Take a guess.
Or is light. So Yotzeir Or is about praising the light of the morning. Ma'ariv Aravim is about Ma'ariv is evening. So praising the beauty or the darkness of the evening.
Close. You're in the right ballpark. All the words you said were right. Or is light. Aravim is evening. The word Yotzeir means to fashion or make. The phrase Yotzeir Or means maker or fashioner of light. So Dan, we're not praising the light with the blessing Yotzeir Or. Who are we praising? God. For doing what?
For making the light.
For making the light. Ma'ariv Arim, the one who causes the evening to come in. Who does that? God. So they're both about light, and I will suggest that light is a synecdoche in this moment. It is one of a set of things that stands in for the whole set, right? Because when we think of light, what are some of the things we think of?
Waking up and getting our day started.
Okay. If I wanted to refer you back to the Star of Redemption, where on the Star of Redemption do we find light?
Creation.
Creation. Right. Good, Steve. Vayehi Or, let there be light. Light is the beginning of the creative process. So when we celebrate light and the separation of light and darkness, what are we celebrating? Creation. Yotzeir Or and Ma'ariv are about creation. You'll see in the next 2 weeks how Ahava Rabbah and Ahavat Olam are about revelation. Emet V'Yitziv and Emet V'Emunah are about redemption. Margaret.
Does it include that you're thankful that you've seen the day, that here you are waking up and it's another day, that hope of, or does it not include that?
Well, let's find out. Let's look at it together. We're going to do a close reading of the text to see what's really in there. So this is the translation of Yotzeir Or as it appears in Mishkan Tefillah. Now I'm going to share something about Yotzeir Or with everybody, which is that the version of Yotzeir Or that appears both in the Reform movement historically and currently is a much pared down version. There's a lot of stuff that's in the full version of Yotzeir that you would read about in a traditional Siddur that is sort of added in. There's a whole section where there's words of praise to God that are given. There's a recitation of the Kedusha that's in there. The reason, by the way, that the Kedusha is in Yotzeir Or is so that if you are praying alone without a minyan, you have an opportunity to say the words of the Kedusha, right? Kadosh, Kadosh, going up, because you only do that if you are in a minyan and there's a repetition of the Amidah by the service leader. And so the rabbis, as they were fashioning the prayer service, they put those words in the Yotzeir. So even if I'm praying it alone, I don't do the full theatrical demonstration, but I at least get to read those verses that are so meaningful to us and declare the holiness of God. So the Reform movement, as it often does, decides what's wheat and what's chaff, takes out all the chaff, and leaves what it thinks is just the wheat in the blessing. But we'll see as we look at these words that it's about creation. Praise to you, Adonai, our God, sovereign of the universe, creator of light and darkness. Well, there we have it. This is about thanking God not for light necessarily, but for all of creation, who makes peace and fashions all things. In mercy, you illumine the world and those who live upon it. In your goodness, you daily renew creation. Every time the sun goes down, every time the sun comes up, Margaret, this is for you, creation is renewed because of you done this. Marabu ma'asecha, Adonai, how numerous are your works, Adonai. In wisdom you formed them all, filling the earth with your creatures. That's not light, that's more creation. Be praised, Adonai, our God, for the excellent work of your hands, and for the lights you created, may they glorify you. Shine a new light upon Zion, that we may swiftly merit its radiance. Praised are you, Adonai, creator of the heavenly lights. Now, in this blessing are a couple of citations or allusions to verses from Torah, and also a deeply important conversation. Who makes peace and fashions all things. That comes to us from the prophet Isaiah, who says in chapter 45, verse 7, I form light and create darkness. I make peace and create evil. Oseh shalom uvarei ra is the verse from Isaiah. What we say in Hebrew is Oseh shalom uvarei et hakol. The rabbis are misquoting intentionally from Isaiah. And they wonder about that. Who forms light and creates darkness, who makes peace and creates evil. I am the Lord who does all those things. So it says in the prophet Isaiah. Where are we? Well, we are now in a different brachot. We were in Mishnah Brachot before. Now we are in the Babylonian Talmud. The follow-up conversation to that exact same Mishnah about what prayers are said when, in the morning and in the evening, and what are the themes of those prayers. With regard to the formula of this blessing, right, it's here, by the way, in the Talmud, that the form, the words themselves of these blessings really get articulated, where the rabbis debate what they should say, where the editorial process takes place. The Gemara asks, let him say the following formula instead. Instead of saying who makes peace and creates evil, we should say who forms light and creates brightness, so as not to mention darkness, which has negative connotations. Right? The rabbis know that darkness is scary. Darkness is fraught. If you're having a blessing called Yotzeir Or, creator of light, the Gemara is wondering, should we take out all allusions to darkness? Because darkness is negative. By the way, this is the point where if you want to jump in and stop me because you're lost, I can go on a roll for a while. So if you need to stop me, just, do this or whatever. So the Gemara answers, we say the blessing as the verse is written in the Bible, and we do not alter that verse. Who forms light and create Yotzeir Or uvorei choshech, creator of light, fashioner of darkness. We say, when we do a citation from the verse in Bible, we leave it as it is. That's what they say. But, objection, if that's so, what about the second half of the verse that says, who makes peace and creates evil? Should we also say, Oseh shalom uvorei ra? Because that's what Isaiah said. If we're citing from the whole verse, shouldn't we cite from the whole verse? Rather, it is written evil. And we euphemistically recite all things to avoid the mention of evil. Right? So one response is, well, listen, we don't need to call evil by name. If we say uvorei et hakol, creator of all things, well, that includes evil. Right? The Reform rabbis played the same fast and loose in the second blessing of the Amidah when they changed the Givurot, right? The second blessing in Givurot has mention of Techiyat HaMeitim, of the revival of the dead, right? The bringing life to the dead. And the early reformers said, well, we're not going to do that. That's yucky, right? We don't need zombies walking around. That's not how we want to think about. So what we'll do is we'll change it to Mechayeh HaKol, who gives life to all, which includes the dead. And they said, if the rabbis of the Talmud can do it for evil, we can do it for dead people, which makes sense to a degree. And they said, so we should make a euphemism for the evil and a euphemism for the darkness. But Rava says, no. We need to say darkness in order to mention the attribute of day at night and the attribute of night during the day, and unifying day and night as different parts of a single entity. Rava is objecting to the notion that we should be fearful of darkness as a concept. Rava is suggesting that darkness is part of every single day. You don't have light without darkness. You don't have darkness without light. And that our blessings that we say for creation, both in the evening and in the morning, should allude to both light and darkness. We don't want Yotzeir Or to only be about light. We can have it be more about light because you say it in the morning when it's light outside, but we want to mention darkness also. Susan.
So if we only have good things, light, then we can't appreciate it if we don't also have the negative, the opposite, what darkness. We can't appreciate all the good things if we don't also suffer some of the negative things.
I think you're absolutely right. And I think that what I shouldn't say I think, what ends up happening is the Talmud splits the difference. The Talmud takes Rava's wisdom to say that we don't need to impose the negative connotation onto darkness that some have suggested, right? They're rejecting the premise that darkness has a negative connotation. And so we should mention both during our blessing, because Susan, the counterpoint to what you just said is, yeah, there's sadness in this world, there's evil in the world, there's pain in the world. But when we're putting together a prayer rubric, it's fair to ask the question whether and how often we need to refer to those things. We don't need every single one of our blessings to be a balance of good and evil, right? We can have our prayers be overall a generally positive thing. And so what Rava does says, yes. And in this instance, it's not even a question because darkness isn't negative. It's a part of nature, right? It's a part of nature. There was darkness, there was light, there was evening, there was morning, right? Darkness is not a thing to be worried about. In the same way that evil is a thing to be worried about. Isaiah says in his verse, God who's creator of evil. And the rabbis are going to say, well, okay, it's true, but do we need to draw our attention to that in our morning blessings? It's part of the morning liturgy and the traditional liturgy to recite the binding of Isaac every single day. It's part of the traditional liturgy to recite the story of the Sea of Reeds closing in and drowning the Egyptians every single day. And the Reform rabbi said, you know what? Yes, those are part of our history. And yes, we ought to engage with them meaningfully. But we don't have to every day. We don't have to every day. We can take a break from some of those things that are more heavier and weighty. And so when it comes to the question of evil, we're going to have a different presumption. The Gemara continues and says, granted, the attribute of night is mentioned during the day, as we say, Borei or Yotzeir Or uvorei choshech. But where do we have night? Where do we say day during the night? Well, we'll see that in the blessing over the radiant lights, there's no mention of who forms light. But Abaye says, we roll light away from darkness and darkness to light, which we'll see in Ma'ariv. This notion that in both blessings, evening and morning, there's a mention of both light and dark, reinforcing this connection that light and darkness are this expression of creation. So we're left here with this notion that we're okay taking evil out. subsuming it into this idea of all things. But in the morning blessing, we want to demonstrate that light and dark go back and forth. Back and forth, back and forth, back and forth, back and forth. Because they're the first example of creation, of which there are many. Right? We have this other illusion. Psalm 104. Ma rabu ma'asecha Adonai. How numerous are your works, O God. Kulam b'chochma asita mal'ah ha'aretz kinyanecha. With your wisdom you formed them all, filling the earth with your creatures. This is not about light at all. This is about the entirety of creation. All of this, by the way, is backwards facing. All of this is praising God for what God did at the moments of creation. With one exception. Can anyone find it?
There's no mention of humanity.
Sure there is. Your creatures. The entire blessing is backward facing except for this line. Or chadash al tzion ta'ir v'nizkei chulanu mehera le'oro. Shine a new light upon Zion, that we may all swiftly merit its radiance. This is forward thinking. This is future considering. This is a directive we're giving to the Holy One. Margaret.
Well, sometimes light can be a bad thing and darkness can be a good thing. You need protection. So I think nothing's all bad or all good. It's how you look at it.
Absolutely. But there's this notion implied in this statement that we are giving God an instruction or a plea. For whatever reason, as Margaret just alluded to, either the light that's on Zion is bad, or there's a lack of light, which is bad, but we're saying to God, we need something new to happen in the future. We are asking you to do something in the future. Or chadash al tzion ta'ir. Shine a new light upon Zion. That is not about creation. At least not the creation of the past. If anything, it's about asking God to do a new act of creation, making a new light. And I only raise this as the exception that proves the rule, in the sense that this is not about the creation of the past. If anything, it's the beginning of the laying of the seeds of a redemption. Right? That we're going to go from light as the example of creation. This is about redemptive. This is, may we merit it, right? This is that personal redemption piece. May we, through our acts, swiftly merit the radiance of Zion, right? A return to Zion, a new light on Zion, that's very redemptive in its imagery, right? That time when we're all going to walk back up onto the plaza of the temple together in the light of God. What's interesting about this line is that it did not exist in any of the Reform Movement prayer books until 2008. It's part of the traditional liturgy, was left out of Union Prayer Book, because back then the movement wasn't even Zionist. And even in the late 60s, early 70s, when Gates of Prayer was published, this was not added in. We added it back in 2007, 2008, when Mishkan Tefillah was published. I want to read to you a quick verse from Rav Kook, the first chief rabbi of Israel. The light of Israel is not a utopian dream or some abstract morality or merely a pious wish and a noble vision. It does not wash its hand of the material world and all its values, abandoning the flesh and society and government to wallow in their impurity and forsaking the forces of nature which fell in the fall of man to remain in their lowest state. Rather, it is a raising of all life. Or Chadash al Tzion Ta'ir is about all of life, all of creation. We will all benefit from when that happens. The evening blessing is a little bit, has less to it. But this question of why does it say you are creator of day and night? Well, that's the conversation we just had about Rava, right? That the evening and the morning blessings have to both mention morning and night, light and dark. And then throughout it, the big thing that's in Ma'ariv is about the passage of time. Evening into being, alter the time, change the season, set the stars on their courses, day into night, distinguishing one. It's about the passage of time. And this notion that the passage of time and the orderly passage of time is an expression of creation. That God set all the celestial beings into place. So we would have a thing called a day, and a thing called a month, and a thing called a year. And they are examples of the wisdom and the brilliance of God to make it happen in that way. And so that as we see time process as it is meant to, we are experiencing the continuation of the miracle of creation. It's pretty heavy stuff. And that is what we are asked to celebrate as we offer these blessings. We get to participate in witnessing creation, not because we lived all those millions of billions of years ago, but every single evening and every single morning. As the stars and the sun and the moon and the celestial bodies, as they go on their course, the act of creation continues. And if we're good enough, as Rob Cook suggests, we can participate as well. We contribute. We do the good stuff. We add to it. One last little tidbit I'm going to offer, and then we're going to wrap up. There's an interesting conversation. This is another book, the Mishnah Torah. This is Maimonides' first work of halakha, how Jews ought to behave in practice. And these are the laws of the reading of the Shema. If one cites the second blessing before the first, either in the morning or in the evening, and whether they're before or after the Shema, he has fulfilled his duty. Meaning, you could say Ahavat Olam before Ma'ariv Aravim. Doesn't matter. Right? Because the Mishnah says 2 before, 2 after. 2 before, doesn't matter the order. It counts. If you get it wrong. For no order has been statutorily fixed for the blessings. If in the morning service, one first blessing begins with Yotzeir Or and concludes it Ma'ariv Aravim, he has not fulfilled his duty. What Maimonides is saying is that the last line, Baruch atah Adonai Yotzer HaMe'orot, Baruch atah Adonai HaMa'ariv Aravim, those two lines are not interchangeable. You have to conclude the prayer properly with the right chatima. But you could read all of Yotzer and end with Ma'ariv, and it counts for the evening. You can read all of Ma'ariv, but end with the Yotzer in the morning, and it counts, but not vice versa. Which is a suggestion that the content of the two blessings themselves are interchangeable. They're both about light, darkness, evening, morning. Yes, Yotzer is more about light. Yes, evening is more about time changing. But thematically, they are interchangeable. If you begin with the formula, Ma'ariv Aravim, and conclude in the morning, Yotzeir Or, you have fulfilled your duty. Thus, in the evening, if you begin Ma'ariv and end Yotzer HaMe'orot, you haven't fulfilled. But if you begin Yotzeir Or and end with Ma'ariv, you've concluded. For the essential element of the blessings is the conclusion. A little tidbit of understanding Jewish prayer. If you want to know what the prayer is all about, look to the Chatima, the last line, the signature. That's what it's all about. All of it, that's the resolve. That the whole blessing is whereas, resolved, God created the heavenly lights. Resolved, God turns day into night and vice versa. That's what it's all about. What we're going to do in the next couple of weeks is delve more into this and look at the other blessings of the morning and the evening, Ahavat Olam, Ahava Rabbah, and the blessings around redemption, to talk about what's in them and how they continue to uphold this notion of creation, revelation, and redemption. My goal for everyone in all this is that not only will you learn some stuff, but as you join us for Shabbat services and you worship, it's going to offer a deeper sense of meaning of what we're doing as we say what these blessings are all about. And you can hopefully situate yourself in this theologic journey along the way. Questions, concerns, objections?
What was the word you used at the beginning, Rabbi, for Baruch atah Adonai Eloheinu melech haolam?
Bowie, Ima. Bet, Aleph, Yud. Bowie. Aleph, Mem, Hey. It says Bowie Ima in Hebrew. And it's an acronym for those 6 words. When you're studying liturgy, it just makes it easier than saying those 6 words over and over and over again. Bowie Ima Yotzeir Or V'Rei Choshech. Other questions, other concerns? Okay. Well, then I look forward to seeing everyone again next Tuesday. Stay safe.
All right.
Couldn't tell if I
That's
lost him or
wrap.
not.
I mean, you had